Dad, from tonight on, this house isn't yours anymore. Brandon's voice cracked just enough to sound human as he dropped the new keys onto the rug, right in front of the 12-foot Christmas tree, still glowing in our living room. The brass keys clinked like the final nails in a coffin. Vanessa stood behind him in her red heels, silent, holding a champagne flute she hadn't touched. Outside, the December wind scraped along the siding like it was trying to warn me, but too late. I didn't move, not even to blink. I just stared at the keys, thinking how they caught the light the same way Maria's wedding ring used to when she opened presents in this room. How do you lose a house you're still standing inside? Before you continue, don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where and when you're watching. The room smelled of pine needles and burnt cinnamon from a candle that had been flickering since morning. The leather on the old armchair behind me had cracked into pale veins from years of winter heat. All of it mine, until now. Brandon picked up the envelope from the marble coffee table, the one I built by hand 25 years ago when I couldn't afford a real one, and slid it into his jacket pocket like it was just another receipt. "It's done," he said flatly. "Signed, filed, effective tonight." I heard myself ask, though my voice sounded like it came from underwater. "You forged my signature." He looked at me, finally, eyes cold, jaw clenched. "I protected what's mine." The lights on the tree blinked once, like the house itself was wincing. And in that moment I realized he hadn't just changed the locks. He had erased 35 Christmases from the life we shared. It was the moment this quiet home turned into the stage of a family drama I never imagined I'd be starring in. The house had been appraised at $480,000 last spring, though I never thought of it in numbers until Brandon used them like ammunition. I bought it in 1988, back when Dallas was still stretching its arms into the prairie. Back then, $1,850 a month felt like climbing a mountain with cinder blocks tied to my ankles. Yet every first of the month I mailed the check before buying groceries, as if the bank owned not just my mortgage, but my breath. The kitchen tiles still bore the faint hairline crack from when Brandon dropped his toy fire truck at age 5. He'd cried harder than the tile broke. Maria had knelt beside him, wiping tears with one hand while stirring a pot of gingerbread glaze with the other. The smell of cinnamon and sugar filled the air that night, seeping into the drywall like a promise. "One day," she whispered to me as Brandon slept on the couch, "this will all be his." Back then, I believed her. Every December, we hung lights along the eaves until my fingers went numb. Maria would hand me warm cocoa through the window, while Brandon shouted instructions from the lawn, wearing the oversized reindeer sweater that swallowed him whole. Now the hooks still cling to the gutters, rusted and empty, like little hands waiting for someone who isn't coming back. "It's not just wood and nails," Maria used to say. "It's memory, fastened down." She was right, I didn't build a house. I built 35 Christmases into the walls. So when Brandon changed the locks, he didn't just evict me. He stripped those years off the studs and handed them to someone who never lived them. That's the cruelest part about family drama, when it stops being about love and becomes about property lines. I walked through the empty living room one last time the morning after, counting each creak of the floorboards like beads on a rosary. At the mantel, the faint outline of Maria's stockings still marked the paint. "What's a home worth?" I murmured to no one. "If it forgets who bled for it." No one answered. Houses rarely do. The front door clicked shut behind me like the lid of a coffin. I stood on the porch with nothing but a scuffed leather suitcase and the winter gnawing at my ears. The wreath Maria had made from pine cones sagged on the door she once painted blue. Now it was locked from the inside. The neighborhood was silent, except for the faint hum of Christmas lights buzzing along the eaves. Snow had dusted the sidewalk like powdered sugar over something burnt. My breath fogged in the dark, as if even the air didn't want to stay near me. Brandon didn't follow me out. Vanessa did. She leaned against the doorway, arms folded, her silhouette framed by the golden warmth of the house behind her. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," she said. I stared at her, at the home glowing behind her, like an oven I wasn't allowed to enter. "35 years," I whispered. "And I get 20 seconds on the porch." She shrugged. "We all get what we sign for." The suitcase handle dug into my palm, as if trying to anchor me, but there was nothing left to hold on to. By the time I reached my truck parked at the curb, my fingers were stiff and pink, trembling against the keys. I sat there for a while, engine off, listening to the echo of the life I had just been written out of. Was this what betrayal sounded like? Quiet, efficient, like white paper sliding into a file drawer? The radio crackled when I turned the ignition. A soft voice sang Silent Night on low volume, too gentle for what I felt. I drove south on Jefferson Boulevard, the city hollowed out by holiday closures, every window glowing with families that weren't mine. Deceit, I thought, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just whispers you out the door. The Redwood Motel sign flickered like a dying match when I pulled in at 11:47 p.m. The clerk barely looked up from his phone. "$55 a night," he said, sliding a keycard across the counter. The room smelled of bleach and old air conditioning. The carpet was thin enough to see the concrete ribs beneath. I lay on the bedspread that crinkled like wax paper, staring at the cracked ceiling tiles until they blurred. All those years, and this was the roof I ended up under. A stranger's ceiling over a stranger's bed on Christmas Eve. How do you measure a life? By what you build, or by what you're allowed to keep? Elliot sat across from Martin Rowe in the cramped corner office on the third floor of a faded brick building off Elm Street in Dallas. The waiting room had smelled of stale coffee and old carpet glue, but here in Martin's office, everything smelled like paper. Aged, dry, and full of grudges. Dust trembled on the blinds when the heater kicked on. Martin adjusted his wire-frame glasses and spread the documents on his desk like he was laying out evidence from a cold case. Elliot's own name looked strange, printed in bold across the top of the deed, almost like it belonged to someone else. His signature, though, stopped him cold. He had signed thousands of contracts in his life, construction bids, loan papers, payroll checks, and he could spot the angle of his own slant from across the room. This one didn't have it. Martin traced the line with his pen. "That's not a wet signature," he said quietly. "That's a scan. A copy of your old signature pasted in digitally." He looked up. "And look at the notary stamp. Wrong issue date. The registrar's seal says April, but this was supposedly signed in June." Elliot leaned forward, feeling something hard coil in his chest. "You're saying they forged it?" Martin didn't flinch. "If this is what it looks like, Brandon has no legal claim, no right to change the locks, no right to sell, nothing." For a moment, the hum of the heater was the only sound in the room. Outside, traffic whispered along Elm like water running over stones. Elliot's mind kept flashing through images of the house, the crack in the kitchen tile, the smell of cinnamon from Maria's gingerbread glaze, the rusted light hooks on the gutters. It felt obscene that all of it now lived on paper someone had defiled. "He took my home with a mouse click," he said, almost to himself. Martin folded the papers neatly, his hands steady in a way Elliot's no longer were. "I can petition the county clerk to freeze any transfer until we investigate. But I'll need everything, bank statements, property tax receipts, proof you maintained the place. This won't be quick." "Nothing about this has been quick," Elliot murmured. Martin studied him, then said more gently, "He's your son. This won't just be about law. It's going to be personal. Messy. Like all real family drama." Elliot looked at the empty legal pad in front of him, its pale lines waiting. The thought of sifting through decades of paper felt like digging his own life out of a landfill. Yet he knew he would. "I'll bring you everything," he said. "Every nail, every bill, every winter I paid for." As he walked back to his truck, the sky was the color of unpolished steel. The wind coming down Elm Street felt colder than the one outside his motel. Maybe because this was the first time he understood the scale of what Brandon had done. Not just theft, but the careful rewriting of a lifetime. The kind of deceit that hides inside signatures and smiles. And for the first time since that night on the porch, Elliot felt something new ignite beneath the grief. A small, sharp will to fight. The story still has many unexpected twists. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss them. Elliot spent the next morning buried in the back room of his rented unit, the one that still smelled faintly of sawdust and old sweat. The motel bed had left a pattern of springs in his shoulder blade, and his eyes ached from staring at the ceiling all night, replaying 35 years of what for. Now those years were spilling across the folding table he'd bought at Home Depot for $39, as if his whole life could be reduced to crumpled receipts and faded ink. The first folder contained the roof repair, $14,200 from a storm in 2009. He remembered climbing up there himself with a flashlight at midnight, water dripping through the rafters like the house was weeping from its skull. Maria had stood below with a towel, catching the leaks in a salad bowl. She laughed back then, said the house was just sweating out its demons. The roofer hadn't laughed when he handed over the bill. The next stack was from the hardwood floors, $23,000, laid down plank by plank over 2 sticky August weeks. He'd done half the sanding himself to save labor costs. Brandon had been 13, stomping through with soccer cleats and leaving crescent-shaped dents in the new boards. Elliot had followed him around with a rag like a man erasing his own child's footsteps before they set. Then came the stone fireplace, $8,700 in neatly typed invoices, the kind of number you don't forget because it sounds like a used car. He remembered Maria's face glowing orange in that first fire, and Brandon tossing marshmallows into the flames, missing every single time. Each miss had left a black blister on the new hearth. Elliot had scrubbed them away before anyone noticed. He sat back, rubbing his eyes, the receipts spread out like fallen leaves around him. "I didn't just buy heat," he muttered. "I bought winters." The words sounded strange, half bitter, half proud, like something you'd read in a poorly written obituary and then realize was true. His phone buzzed. An alert from his bank reminding him the motel charge had cleared. $55. The irony made him laugh, sharp and dry. 35 winters purchased at full price, and here he was paying by the night like a tourist in his own collapse. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began writing each figure in a column. 14,200 plus 23,000 plus 8,700. The numbers rose like steps on a staircase he had built only for Brandon to climb. He imagined his son on top of it now, arms crossed, surveying the view as if he'd hiked it himself. It was almost funny, if you liked your humor black and slightly poisonous. "This is how revenge stories begin," he said under his breath, though the word felt too theatrical for how quiet the room was. Maybe this wasn't revenge. Maybe it was just gravity, things stolen falling back to where they belonged. The pen dug into the paper as he totaled the column. Elliot stared at the sum until the digits blurred. Every dollar had been a brick, and every brick had been taken without so much as a thank you. He gathered the receipts into neat stacks, labeling each with years. Decades of sacrifice reduced to folders thin enough to slip into a briefcase. He smiled faintly at the absurdity. The house had been heavy enough to bow his shoulders, but here it was, fitting easily under one arm. Elliot chose a corner table at the old cafe on Maple Avenue, the kind with wobbly chairs and chipped mugs that somehow outlasted half the marriages in Dallas. The bell over the door still gave that lazy jingle, and the same smell of burnt espresso lingered like an unpaid bill. He stirred his black coffee until it sloshed over the rim, as if the cup could answer the questions no one else would. "Elliot Hayes?" a voice said, warm and cracked around the edges. He looked up to see Carl Whitman, his former neighbor from across the cul-de-sac, bundled in a tan overcoat and carrying the same grin he used to wear while mowing his lawn shirtless. They shook hands, Carl's grip firm as always, though his eyes darted like a man who'd brought news he wished he hadn't. "Heard about the house," Carl said quietly, sliding into the seat opposite. "Brandon really did it, huh?" Elliot managed a thin smile. "Depends what you call it. If you mean changing the locks on Christmas Eve, yes. If you mean holding his life together, not so much." Carl hesitated, then leaned in, lowering his voice over the hiss of the milk steamer. "Word is he's drowning. Not just behind on bills. I mean deep. Heard from a guy at Chase Bank. Brandon tried to refinance the place last month, got denied. Rumor says he owes around $250,000 to some private lenders you don't find in phone books." The number lodged in Elliot's chest like a nail. $250,000. Enough to burn through a lifetime of roofs and floorboards and fireplaces. He pictured Brandon pacing in that house, every room echoing with unpaid debt, and Vanessa calculating their escape like she was planning a vacation. "He's planning to sell it," Carl added, stirring his tea with the slow dread of someone watching an accident in real time. "As soon as the holidays are over. Quick sale, cash buyer, no inspections, no questions." Elliot felt his jaw tighten, though his lips curved in something resembling amusement. "How festive," he said. "Nothing says family quite like auctioning off their ghosts before the tinsel's down." Carl almost laughed, then caught the look in Elliot's eyes and stopped. They sat in silence for a moment, the espresso machine coughing behind the counter like it was trying to warn them both. Elliot thought of the forged signature, of the false notary seal, of his name stripped from the deed like old paint. This wasn't just debt, it was strategy. A quiet, deliberate erasure. Carl finished his tea and stood, patting Elliot's shoulder. "I figured you should know." "Thanks," Elliot said, his voice calm in a way that felt borrowed. As Carl left, the bell jingled again, cheerful, oblivious. Elliot stayed seated, watching his reflection ripple in the black surface of his coffee. This was how revenge stories often started. Not with shouting, but with whispered numbers, spoken in warm places while the world outside stayed cold. And for the first time since the locks changed, the bitterness on his tongue didn't taste like defeat. It tasted like resolve. Elliot spotted him across the street before Brandon saw him, leaning against the hood of a black SUV outside Chase Bank on Main Street, scrolling through his phone like the building behind him wasn't about to deny his future. The late December sun bounced off the glass doors, harsh and clinical, like a stage light exposing every crack in the scene. Elliot parked 2 spaces down, engine off, and watched for a moment. Brandon's suit looked expensive enough to suggest solvency, though Elliot knew from the way he kept glancing at his watch that he was timing his charm against a banker's patience. It was almost funny. His son standing there like a stock photo of confidence while his whole life was listing like a sinking boat. He stepped out of his truck, his boots thudding on the pavement. Brandon's head jerked up, eyes narrowing. "Dad?" he said flatly. "This isn't a good time." "Good," Elliot replied, walking closer. "Because I'm not here for good times." Brandon exhaled through his nose, the sound halfway between annoyance and disbelief. "You're following me now? I'm watching what's left of my life get itemized," Elliot said. "Thought I'd see the auctioneer in person." Brandon's jaw tightened. "This isn't your business anymore." Elliot stopped a foot away, close enough to see the faint shadow of stubble on his son's chin, the same pattern he'd once taught him to shave. "You didn't just take a house, Brandon," he said quietly. "You're burying your mother's honor under your debts." For a second, something flickered in Brandon's eyes, then died. "Mom's gone," he said, voice sharp. "And honor doesn't pay interest." The words hit harder than the December air. Elliot's fist clenched at his side, then slammed against the side mirror of his own truck. The sound cracked through the parking lot like a gunshot muffled by snow. Brandon flinched, then covered it with a smirk. Real mature, Brandon said. You know what banks care about? Debt-to-income ratio, not family guilt trips. Funny, Elliot said, his voice like gravel. You always did confuse loans with love. People passing on the sidewalk slowed for half a beat, then kept walking. The way strangers do when they sense a storm brewing, but hope it will choose another town. Brandon slipped his phone into his pocket, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the glass doors without looking back. Elliot stayed rooted on the pavement, breathing hard, his knuckles throbbing. The sunlight on the bank's chrome letters glared back at him like judgment. This was the moment he finally stopped waiting for his son to remember who had built the floor he stood on. This wasn't just rebellion or recklessness anymore. It was calculated deceit, polished into business casual. And Elliot knew, with a clarity that chilled him deeper than the wind, that the next time they met wouldn't be for words. It would be for the truth. Martin's office felt even smaller the second time, though it might have just been the way the blinds cut the winter light into thin white bars across the carpet, like the room itself was holding its breath. Elliot stood by the filing cabinet while Martin hunched over his laptop, the glow turning his glasses into twin coins of light. A cold draft seeped under the window frame, rattling the blinds like loose teeth. Here, Martin muttered, fingers darting across the keyboard. Transfers from Brandon's joint account. Recurring, hidden under vendor codes. Neatly tucked inside maintenance expenses. Clever. Elliot leaned in, reading the line of digits. 32,000. Sent to a company called Silvershore Holdings? He frowned. Never heard of it. Because it doesn't exist, Martin said. At least not here. He clicked again. The screen filled with a business registry from Nevada, where the search bar might as well have said, for people who prefer their money invisible. Shell company. No website, no phone number. But it has a listed board. Elliot felt his stomach tighten, the way it had when Brandon was 16, and he'd caught him lying about wrecking the car. Tell me who. Martin hesitated, then rotated the screen. One name stood out like a lit match in a dark room. Vanessa Cole. Majority shareholder. Filed 6 months ago. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, a siren wailed faintly down Elm Street, fading like a bad memory trying to escape. She's been siphoning equity out, Martin said. Every dollar Brandon pulled from the house went straight into her company. If they sell, she walks away clean. Elliot stared at the name. His son's wife, now glowing on a government ledger, like she'd planted a flag on his ruin. It was almost impressive, in the way termites are impressive if you ignore the house collapsing. Martin closed the laptop slowly, as if afraid the truth might bite. Not just Brandon, he said softly. She's the one holding the knife. Elliot laughed once, low and humorless, and Brandon's just the hand she's wearing. The laugh hung in the air for a beat, then dissolved into silence. He imagined Vanessa at the kitchen island, his kitchen, scrolling through market listings while the house still smelled like pine and guilt. This wasn't desperation anymore. It was architecture. Every betrayal measured, drafted, and built. Martin rubbed his temples. We can use this. Prove fraudulent intent, but it'll be ugly. It already is, Elliot said. His voice was calm, almost gentle, the way a frozen lake looks calm until it breaks. He picked up the stack of receipts from the table, the proof of decades that had turned into props in someone else's scheme. If this whole mess had been theater, he thought, then Vanessa was the playwright, Brandon the understudy, and he was just the man who built the stage. This was no longer a tragedy. It was becoming a revenge story, and Elliot had just learned the villain's real name. The story is slowly revealing its deepest secrets. Subscribe now to follow it all the way. The notary office on Commerce Street sat between a payday loan shop and a shuttered florist, its sign buzzing faintly in the December dark, like it was trying to stay awake. Through the frosted glass, Elliot could see them. Brandon in his charcoal suit, Vanessa in a winter white coat that probably cost more than his first truck. They stood with a man in a navy blazer holding a leather briefcase, the would-be buyer. Papers were spread across the counter like the aftermath of a paper storm, ready for signatures that would turn 35 years of sacrifice into $250,000 in cash. Martin sat beside Elliot in the idling truck, laptop open on his knees. The glow from the screen made his face look carved out of ice. "They're moving fast," he said. "All cash offers close in days, sometimes hours. Then we need to move faster," Elliot murmured. His breath fogged the windshield, curling like smoke from a fire he couldn't put out. Martin tapped the last key, uploading their dossier, the forged signature, the misdated notary seal, the trail of transfers to Nevada, and the corporate filings showing Vanessa Cole as majority shareholder of Silver Shore Holdings. The file zipped off to FBI like a confession delivered by Wi-Fi. "Done," Martin said. "Sent directly to their white-collar crimes unit. Flagged urgent," Elliot nodded, though his hands gripped the steering wheel like he was trying to strangle it. Through the window, he watched Brandon laugh at something the buyer said, the sound muffled by the glass but somehow still sharp. The man had his mother's smile when he wanted something, Maria's same upward curl, but hollow, like someone had scooped the warmth out and replaced it with ambition. Vanessa checked her watch, then placed her hand lightly on Brandon's arm. The gesture was so delicate it could have passed for affection, if Elliot didn't know better. He wondered if she'd practiced it in the mirror, the perfect touch that said, "I love you," and also, "sign faster." Martin followed his gaze and gave a dry, surgical sort of laugh. "It's strange," he said. "I've seen mobsters do this kind of thing with less eyeliner." Elliot almost smiled. Then the pen in Brandon's hand touched the paper, and the almost vanished. He imagined the ink as acid, burning through decades of Christmas lights, patched shingles, sanded floorboards, all of it disappearing under a flourish of someone else's name. The buyer shook Brandon's hand, briefcase snapping shut like the lid on a coffin. Vanessa's eyes glimmered in the overhead light, sharp, metallic, triumphant. Martin closed his laptop. "If the Bureau moves quickly, they'll intercept the sale before it closes. And if they don't, then you'll be watching strangers unwrap presents in your living room," Martin said flatly. Elliot watched his son through the glass, watched him smile and pocket the pen like a trophy. It should have broken him. Instead, he felt something steadier take its place, cold and precise, like steel setting in winter concrete. If they were going to strip his life down to signatures, then he would answer with something signatures couldn't erase. This was no longer a negotiation. It was the opening move of something that would make even their expensive coats feel thin. Elliot sat in the sterile chill of the FBI field office lobby on Young Street, the kind of place where even the air seemed to have passed a background check. The walls were blank except for a framed flag and a clock that ticked like it was judging everyone for being late. His manila folder sat on his lap, swollen with 35 years of receipts, signatures, photographs, his whole life reduced to office supplies. A door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and she appeared. Special Agent Claire Monroe, black suit, hair tied back with the precision of someone who alphabetizes their thoughts. She glanced at him once, then at the folder, as if weighing which one looked more likely to lie. "Mr. Hayes," she said, voice level as a frozen pond. "Follow me." Her office was small but spotless, the kind of tidy that suggested either genius or boredom. She closed the door, sat, and folded her hands. "I've reviewed the preliminary file your attorney submitted. Before we continue," she fixed her eyes on him, sharp as wire. "Do you have evidence this is federal asset fraud?" Elliot placed the folder on her desk like it might detonate. "I do," he said. Then, softer, "And I have all the winters they stole to get it." For the first time, her expression cracked. Not into sympathy, but the faintest twitch of curiosity. She opened the folder and began leafing through. The forged signature with its pixel-perfect angles. The misdated notary seal. The bank transfers funneled into Silver Shore Holdings in Nevada, and the ownership filings naming Vanessa Cole as majority shareholder. The paper whispered under her fingers like a courtroom ghost. Claire spoke without looking up. If this is fabricated, it's sloppy. If it's real, it's ambitious. It's real, Elliot said, and it's about to be sold out from under me while they toast with eggnog. She closed the folder, tapping its edge against the desk until everything aligned in a perfect rectangle again. If they close that sale, unwinding it will take months, years even. But if we can intervene before funds change hands— She paused, studying him like a chessboard. We can stop it. Elliot nodded. Then stop it. She almost smiled. We don't work on sentiment, Mr. Hayes. We work on proof. Quietly. Discreetly. That's fine, he said. I'm done being loud. Claire stood, gathering the folder under her arm. I'll open an inquiry under white-collar crimes. I won't promise results, but I'll promise effort. And for what it's worth. She looked at him for the first time not like a suspect or a nuisance, but like a man who had once built something worth losing. Most people don't fight back. They just fold. Maybe they didn't build with nails, Elliot said. Maybe they didn't have winters worth defending. She gave a single, sharp nod. Go home, Mr. Hayes, or whatever counts as home for now. We'll be in touch. As Elliot stepped back into the sharp December wind, the door whispering shut behind him, he felt something almost unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but the shape where hope could fit once it thawed. The pieces were finally shifting. For the first time, the war wasn't just his anymore. The glass of the notary office window trembled with each note of silent night, drifting from the street outside, muffled by the snow, but clear enough to be cruel. Elliot stood on the sidewalk, coat buttoned high, hands buried in his pockets as if he could keep his bones from remembering the warmth they used to know. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed without mercy. Brandon sat at the counter, pen in hand, posture loose in a way that reminded Elliot of how he used to sit on Christmas morning. Relaxed, confident, sure the world was about to hand him something wrapped in gold. Vanessa stood just behind him, one manicured finger resting on the contract like she was pinning down prey. The buyer waited with a check already signed, his leather briefcase yawning open, hungry. Elliot could see their lips moving, but not the words. He imagined them saying things like liquidation and quick close while calling it opportunity. He wondered if they heard the carol outside, if they even knew what peace sounded like anymore. Then he saw them. Two dark figures reflected faintly in the glass behind the group, moving in sync along the walls like shadows learning to walk. Special Agent Claire Monroe stepped into the doorway first, badge in one hand, the other raised like punctuation. Her partner swept in from the opposite side, coat fluttering like a black flag. Brandon's pen paused mid-stroke. Vanessa's head snapped up, her smile vanishing so fast it might have been an illusion. Claire's voice carried even through the glass, cold and neat. Federal agents, step away from the documents. The buyer blinked, caught between greed and survival, then slowly set his pen down. Brandon turned, confusion melting to something darker. Recognition. His eyes flicked to the door, then to Vanessa, who gave a micro-shake of her head. Elliot felt something uncoil inside him as the agents fanned out, collecting the contracts with gloved hands, sealing them into evidence envelopes. It wasn't joy, more like the first breath after holding it too long. The sight of Brandon standing there empty-handed, pen dangling useless, hit him like a chord resolved after years of dissonance. Snow caught in Elliot's lashes as he stepped back from the window. Behind him, the carolers on the corner swayed under their street lamp halo, still singing about calm and bright as if the world had ever been either. This chapter of their family drama had just ended not with applause but with silence, and a pen that never touched paper. Brandon sat hunched at the edge of the table, wrists still cuffed in front of him, shoulders drawn inward like he was trying to fold himself small enough to disappear. The fluorescent light above flickered just enough to make him look less like a man and more like a sketch someone had given up on. Two agents stood at the door, silent, statues with holsters. Elliot lingered at the threshold, one boot on the tile, the other still on the carpeted hallway, as if even the building wasn't sure he belonged here. The air smelled faintly of copier toner and cold sweat. Brandon didn't look up. He stared at a crack in the tabletop, the way he used to stare at the floor when he was 8, and trying to pretend he hadn't broken the window with a baseball. "You can leave if you want," one of the agents murmured to Elliot. "No," Elliot said softly. "Not yet." He stepped closer, the sound of his boots slow and deliberate, like nails being driven. Brandon flinched almost imperceptibly at each one. "You came to watch me get humiliated," Brandon said finally, voice brittle, still aimed at the crack in the table. Elliot studied him for a long moment. He remembered this same boy kneeling in pajamas on Christmas morning, hair sticking up like bad punctuation, grinning at a toy train. That memory tried to surface and defend him, and then sat back down, embarrassed. "I didn't come for humiliation," Elliot said. His voice was quiet enough that even the light seemed to pause. "I came to take back the truth. Not the house. Just the truth." Brandon's laugh was small and sharp, like glass cracking underfoot. "Truth doesn't pay the mortgage." "Neither did you," Elliot replied, almost gently. For a second, even the agents looked away, as if the words had drawn blood more effectively than anything physical. Brandon's eyes finally lifted, and Elliot saw what had replaced the arrogance. Something thinner, twitching at the edges, like pride after a house fire. There was almost a temptation to feel sorry for him, the same way you almost feel sorry for termites when the fumigation tent goes up. Elliot turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "I built a life for you," he said without looking back, "and you tried to sell it like scrap metal. The difference between us is, I still know what it's worth." The door clicked shut behind him, neat and final. In the hallway, Elliot exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. It wasn't victory exactly, but something close. A fragile shift in the air, like the moment just before dawn when the dark realizes it's outnumbered. This whole saga had pretended to be about money, but standing there, Elliot understood it had always been about memory, bloodlines, and the quiet, catastrophic weight of a family drama gone off the rails. The most dramatic part is still ahead. Don't forget to hit subscribe and join me to the very end. The hearing room smelled like old wood and cold ambition, a mix Elliot knew too well from years in construction bids and city zoning meetings. But this wasn't drywall and permits. This was blood, or at least what passed for it now. He sat quietly in the back row, hands folded over his knee, as if he were just another bored retiree who'd wandered into the courthouse on a slow morning. Brandon sat at the defense table in a navy suit, a shade too confident, the kind that hoped to disguise panic as polish. It didn't. He kept adjusting his cufflinks, though they weren't crooked. Vanessa sat beside him, all white blouse and lacquered calm, like she thought she could outdress federal charges. Her eyes flicked to the gallery once, caught Elliot's for half a second, and then retreated as if they'd brushed against something electric. The clerk read the charges. Asset fraud, forged federal documents, wire transfer misrepresentation, and the words echoed around the wood-paneled room like marbles rolling on tile. Elliot thought they sounded almost clinical for what they really were. Arson, but with paperwork. The prosecutor laid out the timeline, neat and surgical. Brandon's forged signature, the falsified notary seal, the funneling of funds to Silver Shore Holdings in Nevada, where Vanessa just happened to be majority shareholder. With each piece of evidence, Brandon shrank a little, while Vanessa sat perfectly still, like a marble statue waiting to see if fire could melt stone. When the judge asked if the defense wished to speak, their lawyer muttered about misunderstandings and emotional context, which landed with all the impact of a paper umbrella in a hailstorm. Outside the courthouse, a small cluster of reporters waited like vultures disguised in cardigans. One of them shoved a mic at Elliot as he exited, their breath puffing in the cold like eager ghosts. He didn't stop walking, but he caught the headline later, scrolling across the site of Dallas Morning News like a verdict with better font. 66-year-old father wins back home from son using ironclad evidence. He laughed once. Dark and quiet. It was technically true, which was almost the funniest kind of lie. Because he hadn't won back a house, he'd merely stopped them from selling the corpse of a family and calling it progress. Inside, Brandon would be stewing over his tarnished name, and Vanessa would be calculating the exact moment to abandon ship without getting her heels wet. It was almost poetic, if your poetry ran on schadenfreude. Elliot buttoned his coat against the wind and kept walking, the courthouse steps behind him and the city opening ahead. The story wasn't over, but for the first time, it was being told in the right order. And in this particular revenge story, that was the closest thing to justice he needed. The house didn't look like victory when Elliot unlocked the door again. It looked abandoned by hope mid-sentence. The court order had come that morning. Crisp paper, black ink, no apology. The property at 2145 Westbrook Lane, market value $480,000, was legally and solely his again. Just like that. 35 years of building, 2 months of war, and a paragraph to return it. The key slid into the lock like it remembered him, but wasn't sure it forgave him. Inside, the air was still, faintly metallic, the way old memories smell when they've been boxed too long. The living room stood as he had left it that night. Strands of Christmas lights drooping from the eaves, one end blinking stubbornly as if refusing to concede the season was over. Dust filmed every surface in a thin gray verdict. On the mantel sat the half-crushed gift box Maria had once used for her handmade ornaments. The lid caved in, a faint ribbon still clinging to it like a ghost of her handwriting. Elliot picked it up. The ribbon came away in his fingers. He stood there for a long time, coat still on, like a guest at his own wake. The house hummed faintly around him, the refrigerator cycling on, the heat ducts groaning like old knees. Everything was exactly where it should be, and nothing was where it belonged. He lowered himself into the leather armchair, its familiar crackle greeting him like a tired dog too old to stand. For a flicker of a second, he almost expected Brandon to barrel down the hallway in pajamas, Maria chasing with a mug of cocoa. But the hallway stayed empty, and the only thing that barreled was the quiet. This was what winning looked like, apparently. 4 walls, a deed with his name restored, and silence so sharp it could cut paper. Elliot leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling where the shadows of past Decembers lingered faintly like smoke stains. He had his house again. But houses, he thought, don't hug you when you walk through the door. They just wait, patient and hollow, until you decide what they'll be this time. The for sale sign had barely kissed the lawn before the offers started rolling in, which felt a little like vultures sending thank you notes. By the end of the week, the house on Westbrook Lane, $480,000, on paper, 35 years in his bones, belonged to a young couple who said things like open concept and good school district, as if they were describing something that had ever been alive. Elliot handed them the keys with the polite detachment of a surgeon passing off an organ. They smiled too wide, promising to take good care of it, the way people promise to water plants they will inevitably forget. He almost wished them luck. Almost. By the following Monday, he was hauling the last of his boxes into a second-floor walk-up in Plano. 800 square feet, 2 rooms, 1 bathroom with grout old enough to remember Reagan. The rent was low, the walls were thin, and the quiet came pre-assembled. The movers looked at him like they expected a speech, but he just tipped them and closed the door behind them before sentiment could catch up. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by cardboard and echo, and for a strange moment, he felt lighter. The air didn't know him here. The walls hadn't watched him fail. They were just walls, plain, blank, innocent. He unwrapped Maria's photo first, setting it on the shelf above the radiator, the glass slightly cracked from the move. The sight of her smile felt less like a wound and more like a compass now. "I used to think I needed 4 walls," he murmured to the empty room. "Turns out I just needed people who don't lock them." It wasn't triumphant, not in any cinematic way. There was no orchestra, no redemption confetti, just a kettle warming on the new stove, and the small, stubborn pulse of possibility beating under the hum of old pipes. For the first time in years, Elliot didn't feel like he was defending a fortress. He felt like he was starting a life. Snow drifted past the window of Elliot's little apartment in Plano, soft and aimless, as if even gravity had decided to take the holiday off. The radiator hummed like an old man clearing his throat. In the corner, 2 red stockings sagged from a shelf bracket, slightly uneven because he'd hung them with painter's tape. The living room smelled of cocoa and wrapping paper, cheap paper that tore if you breathed on it too hard, which somehow made the gifts inside feel more genuine. His grandchildren sat cross-legged on the rug, their laughter colliding in the air like wind chimes in a warm draft. One of them handed him a mug with both hands, the cocoa sloshing dangerously close to the rim. He took it like it was crystal. They tore into their presents: dollar store puzzles, knitted mittens, a book someone had already read 3 times. Not a single receipt was worth keeping, which felt like the point. Elliot sat back on the couch, his bones grateful for the cushion, and watched their faces flicker with joy in the yellow glow of a thrift store lamp. He thought about the house he had once fought to keep, the marble counters and hardwood floors and price tags sharp enough to cut him. He had won that battle, technically. Then he had walked away. "I used to think the house was the story," he murmured to no one in particular. Turns out it was just the backdrop. Outside, the snowfall thickened, blurring the outlines of everything that used to matter. He felt no pull toward the past, only a steady warmth settling in his chest, like the quiet satisfaction of a wound that has finally scarred over. "This Christmas," he said softly, almost surprised to hear his own voice, "I'm not losing anything at all." And for the first time in years, he believed it. This wasn't a tale of property anymore. It had been a revenge story disguised as love. And somewhere along the way, he had chosen love anyway. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for listening, and may you and your family find health, peace, and the kind of love that endures. And perhaps in the next story, we will open another door, one that leads deeper into the hidden truths families keep, and the resilience that brings them back to light.